Good day. At the tail end of the video that I did yesterday about the crisis in Kazakhstan, I floated the possibility that the embattled Kazakh president, Mr. Tokayev, might call on the Collective Security Treaty Organization, the military alliance led by Russia, in order to help him stabilize the situation in Kazakhstan, where a deepening crisis, seemed to be underway, with the second city, Almaty, essentially falling under the control of people that I will for the moment continue to refer to as protesters. In the event, that is exactly what happened. Within a few hours, there was a virtual meeting of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, chaired by the Armenian Prime Minister, Nikol Pashinyan. It received this request from Mr. Tokayev. It immediately granted the request, and as I am speaking, we're getting film from Russia of Russian paratroopers apparently being deployed to Kazakhstan. A deployment which is taking place, I should say, extremely fast. Now, the number of troops that are going to be deployed from Russia and from the rest of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, grouping that includes countries like Belarus, Armenia, Kazakhstan itself, Kyrgyzia and Tajikistan, the number of troops who are going to be deployed is going to be apparently around 5,000, hardly enough to control a whole country the size of Kazakhstan. But of course, it's unlikely that these troops will play that sort of role. Most of the task of bringing the situation across Kazakhstan under control will fall upon the national forces of Kazakhstan, the Kazakh army, and the various security forces. And that now brings me to the internal situation and what exactly has happened in Kazakhstan. Well, I think that over the course of yesterday, I think it became clear, increasingly clear, that this was a concerted attempt by some people to overthrow the government of that country. It's not exactly clear to me, even now, who was involved. I know that there are claims circulating all over the place that this was an attempted color revolution and that there was a foreign intelligence involvement in it. And by the way, within the last few hours, the Russian government has in effect said as much. But before I fully accept that, I should say, highly likely possibility, I would want to see some evidence. I make that point because obviously mere declarations of foreign involvement in an event of this kind are all very well, and they may be true, and they probably are true in this case, but declarations are not evidence, and I'm the sort of person who always likes to see evidence before I assume automatically that something is true. Nonetheless, whilst we can't definitely say that there was foreign involvement, it does seem as if there was a concerted attempt, an organized attempt by someone to seize power in Kazakhstan over the course of the last few days. Now, let's remind ourselves, this began as a protest about increases in fuel prices. These are not prices of heating fuel, they're prices of liquefied petroleum gas used by cars, which have been capped for a long time, creating price distortions in the Kazakh economy, which the technocrats in the Kazakh government decided to lift without apparently paying much heed to the political consequences. But it's clear that something happened as a result of that decision to increase those prices or to lift the caps on those prices, which was much more organised and which bears all the hallmarks of a high degree of organisation and planning. What seems to have happened is that armed groups flooded into the former capital, Almaty. I say armed groups, I mean not all of the people involved were armed, but they seem to have known where they could collect arms. It's interesting, for example, that one of the reports said that they attacked an arms depot and were able to gain possession of weapons, of assault rifles and such things. Somebody needs to have known where that depot was and needs to have been able to circulate that information amongst protesters. And it's clear that, as well as that attack on that particular arms depot, there were attacks on police stations, concerted attacks on police stations, attacks in which the attackers used firearms, and also, dare I say it, as a result of the police having to withdraw from the streets of Almaty in order to defend their own stations and police points, the result was that the city became emptied for certain incredibly dangerous hours of police, and this of course made it possible for attacks to then be launched on public buildings, the mayor's office, the former presidential palace, and perhaps most critically the airport. And the decision to attack the airport seems to have been made specifically in order to prevent military reinforcements arriving in the capital from abroad. Possibly, there are some reports that some of the protesters even said as much, from Russia. So this looks like a fairly organised affair. And of course, there have been various attempts to run off to carry out this same operation in various towns and cities across Kazakhstan. And I have to say that it does remind me, it is all very reminiscent of what happened in Ukraine in late February, not 2014. I remember that at that time, it was, of course, we're talking about events that happened over the course of the winter. There was a concerted drive by militia units which had managed to gain possession of weapons. There was a concerted attempt to storm public buildings. In fact, not just an attempt, that was in fact what happened. Public buildings, starting of course with Maidan Square, but eventually escalating to gain control of the Parliament building, the government offices, places like that. And of course, all of this happened in the run-up to the Winter Olympics. In that case, it was the Winter Olympics in Sochi. This time, it's the Winter Olympics in Beijing. Now, the reason that uprising, if one can call it that, succeeded was because the Ukrainian government, the president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, left Kiev. He was supposed to visit Kharkov to attend a conference there, and all these events took place in his absence. In this particular case, the President Tokayev, far from leaving his capital, remained at his post and went on television, national television, to make it clear that he was staying put. And I'm sure that played an important role in stiffening the resistance of the authorities. But of course, there was another factor that, again, to some extent, reminds me of the events in Ukraine. In the case of Ukraine, there was a dithery president, Yanukovych, who over weeks and months continuously resisted attempts to try and persuade him by his security services to order a firm crackdown. So he would deploy police and riot police to Maidan Square, and instead of sending them to clear the square, at the last moment he would pull them back and accept mediation from the European Union, broker agreements with the people who were in control of Maidan Square. And the result was that as these weeks and months stretched on, the police forces that he commanded, and which had been initially very loyal to him and to his government, became increasingly exhausted and demoralized, and the leaders of the police forces began to feel increasingly as if the president would eventually betray them and would abandon them. And he did, in fact, dismiss some of his most senior security officials and, in fact, allow investigations to be launched against those officials, even as he was relying on the security forces to retain control of the country. So we had a weak and divided government in Ukraine, which is what ultimately made the events in 2014 possible. And it's quite obvious to me that at the outset of this affair, we had a weak and divided government in Kazakhstan. I've already spoken about this bizarre, this extremely unstable dual power situation in which the president, Mr. Tokayev, was in nominal control of the country. He was the head of state. The government was accountable to him. But the previous president, Nursultan Nazarbayev, the man who has ruled Kazakhstan ever since the Soviet Union broke up, he remained, in effect, in control of all of the security forces, of the army, the police, the intelligence agencies, and he seemed to be the person who was really pulling the strings in the country. And I've said in previous programs that I had in my previous program that it was quite clear to me that some kind of power struggle between Tokayev and Nazarbayev was underway, and that there'd been a rather curious situation at a summit meeting in St. Petersburg, where Putin had separate discussions with each of these two people. And I did wonder what exactly that meant, and it did seem to me as if Putin was trying to mediate between the two. I'm going to now go a bit further than this. I've been doing some more reading about this matter. I've been looking into this matter a bit more closely, and my distinct impression is that Nazarbayev, who is often thought of as a friend and ally of Russia, was somebody who, as far as the Russians were concerned, was becoming increasingly unreliable. I have spoken about the way in which he, in the last years of his rule, seemed to be pursuing policies of Kazakhstanization in Kazakhstan, trying to limit Russian influence as much as possible. I've spoken about how he was changing the alphabet of the Kazakh language from Cyrillic to Latin, and how he announced at a conference, a business conference in Russia, which I attended in 2016, how he seemed to be moving to convert the entire Kazakh legal system onto a British English common law system, with apparently judges and lawyers imported from Britain. And I remember how negatively that was received by his Russian audience, an audience, by the way, made up overwhelmingly of business people. And it was also the case that the Kazakh oil and gas industries were dominated by Western oil companies, Western oil majors. And on top of all of that, as I also remember, Nazarbayev was taking an extremely distant position from Russia on the issue of Ukraine. He was essentially hinting that his sympathies in this crisis were more with Ukraine than with Russia, something which also didn't go down very well with the Russians. Last but not least, at that very same conference, which I attended back in 2016, he quite openly hinted that his preferred choice of successor was his own daughter, something which, again, I got the distinct impression the Russians were none too happy with. So I suspect that what has happened is that the Russians, who have immense influence in Kazakhstan, have been wanting to leverage Nazarbayev out for some time, and I suspect that it was Russian influence that partly explains his completely unexpected resignation in 2019 and the appointment of Tokayev as president. But as we have seen, Nazarbayev did not actually quit the scene, though Tokayev was put in nominal charge of the country. Nazarbayev continued to the extent that he could to pull the strings, and he seems, as I said, to have in fact intensified these policies of trying to distance Kazakhstan culturally from Russia, something which appears, by the way, to have annoyed the very large Russian-speaking community in Kazakhstan, which, by the way, goes far beyond ethnic Russians. In fact, I've been told that Russian is, in fact, the preferred language of the majority of the population, including very large numbers of people who would consider themselves to be ethnically Kazakh. And this apparently caused the ruling party, Nazarbayev's party, to lose around 1 million votes in the last Kazakh parliamentary elections. Kazakhstan has elections, though they have been very controlled up till now, suggesting that the support for the government from the Russian-speaking community was weakening, whilst at the same time Nazarbayev's actions, which may have been intended to win him support amongst the more Kazakh nationalist side of the population, well, that clearly wasn't enough to win them over. They continued to see him as somebody who had been a former member of the Soviet Politburo, and they still resented his pervasive controls of the country. And I've also learnt from various people that perhaps in concert with all of this, in concert with all these attempts by Nazarbayev, presumably in part in order to try and maintain some kind of personal control of Kazakhstan, this attempt to distance himself and Kazakhstan from Russia, one consequence was that the economic picture within Kazakhstan was starting to deteriorate, and in fact has been deteriorating for some time. Now, again, it's difficult to get exact figures for this. I should say that statistics coming out of a country like Kazakhstan are not necessarily reliable. That, by the way, applies as much to the demographic statistics, which appear to show a gigantic drop in the Russian, ethnic Russian population of the country. But as well as those, the economic statistics are not apparently entirely reliable. And I've heard people say, people who knew Kazakhstan, that whereas 10 years ago, conditions in Kazakhstan, economic conditions in Kazakhstan, were very like those in Russia. The two countries were very similar at an economic level. In fact, they were closely integrated with each other. Over the last 10 years, the gap between Kazakhstan and Russia has grown, and today it is noticeably poorer. Living standards in Kazakhstan have fallen significantly. And of course, on top of that, you had this decision, as I said, probably taken by technocrats, to create to lift the cap on liquefied petroleum gas, which of course was the trigger point for these protests. But it's quite clear to me that someone, I'm not going to say at the moment who, saw their opportunity, has obviously been organising and preparing for quite a long time. They noticed this division and weakness in the government, and they took the steps in Almaty that I've said, and they tried to launch attacks on government buildings and on the security forces across the rest of the country. So this was clearly an organized attempt to seize control, but it's striking that, again, the president on this occasion, Mr. Tokayev, acted resolutely. He dismissed Nazarbayev from his post as head of the Security Council, and he sacked Nazarbayev's men from all the security ministries, putting his own people in charge. And this happened over the course of a chaotic day, whilst most of Almaty spiraled out of control, out of the government's control. But by the end of the day, with the president finally in full control of the government, and with Russia and the Collective Security Treaty Organization pledging support and agreeing to send peacekeeping troops, it seems that the initiative turned and that the attempt to carry out this coup, as I will call it, began to miscarry. It's quite obvious to me that whilst this power struggle was underway within the government of Kazakhstan, the military and security forces, which had still been nominally under Nazarbayev's control, were uncertain what to do, were not receiving clear orders. But by the end of the day, with Tokayev's men in charge of all of the ministries, they began to respond and very, very rapidly regained control of the airport. And over the course of the night, the first units of the military and of the security forces began to re-enter Almaty, and it seems that they've been able to regain control of most, or at least all, of the government buildings that were lost. Though some of the protesters, that there are still protesters, armed protesters, still around, still circulating in the streets, and there've been some gun battles between the security forces and some of these people, and the situation is still far from being under control. So it seems to me that this is the general narrative of this story. Now, as I said, when I said that somebody was trying to organize this affair, again, as I said, I'm sure lots of people will say that this was partly done by foreign intelligence agencies. America has been mentioned. Pepe Escobar, a long-standing commentator, has claimed that it was the British, something I find extremely unlikely, by the way. I very much doubt that British intelligence has the reach or the understanding or the resources to carry out and organize an operation as complex as this in a distant Central Asian state. But I would stress again that whoever was involved, clearly there must have been a large number of people involved domestically. Clearly some part of the Kazakh elite themselves were involved. Now, there seems to have been quite a lot of violence over the course of this attempt, this coup attempt. There was clearly a breakdown in public order. There was violent looting of shops and businesses, and apparently even some residential homes, which is what inevitably happens when police completely disappear from the streets, especially in a condition of overall violence. But I suspect that over the next couple of days, as the situation continues to stabilise, this process will run its course. Now, here I want to make what I think is the most important point about this whole affair, and that is the decision by Russia, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, to intervene. The Russian deployment of a peacekeeping force. As I said, it's in theory going to be drawn from all of the various countries of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, but the core of it will be Russian paratroopers. Now, the key point to understand about that is that it has an enormous psychological effect on the situation on the ground. It means that any military or police officials in Kazakhstan who might have had prior loyalties to Nazarbayev and who were skeptical about Tokayev's chances will now know that Russia is backing Tokayev and is backing Tokayev by putting boots on the ground within the country. And that is also going to have a dramatic psychological effect. It's going to create a stiffening within the security services and a renewed determination to take steps to bring the whole situation within the country under control. It's perhaps less important what these Russian troops actually do than the mere fact that they are there. Now, if we go back a year, something not entirely dissimilar happened during the protests in Belarus. At that time, again, there was, for a time, some uncertainty about the ability of the president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, to keep control of the situation. But again, rather like Tokayev, though to a much greater degree, in fact, Lukashenko stood his ground, made himself visible, spoke to the security forces, kept the loyalty of the government intact and of the security forces intact. But critically important also was the fact that as the protests unfolded, Lukashenko had the support of the Russians. And that took two forms. The Russians provided journalists and media people to take over control of Belarus's principal TV and radio broadcaster, ensuring that TV and radio broadcasts continued uninterrupted, even as there was an attempt to organize a strike amongst its Belarusian personnel. And perhaps even more important still was news that the Russians had put together a force of 5,000 security people ready to be sent to Belarus in the event that there was an attempt by the Belarusian opposition to storm public buildings. And again, that had an effect of stiffening the resolution of the Belarusian security forces to the point where, as it turned out, those Russian personnel, that Russian unit, didn't actually have to be deployed to Belarus in the end. Well, on this occasion, a unit of comparable size is being deployed to Kazakhstan, but the effect will be the same. It will, as I said, stiffen the resolution of the Kazakh security forces and make it more certain that they will act to bring the situation under control. Now, what does this mean? Because for me, this is the single most important thing about protests, about this whole protest movement. What it means is that provided a government which within the Collective Security Treaty Organization structure retains its nerve, it is now immune to color revolution and regime change operations, and indeed these sort of coups, because it can always, from now on, know that it can rely on the Russians. And the Russians, with their vast military and their huge security forces, have shown that they are both willing and able to deploy security forces and troops to support a government that faces this kind of pressure. So this cycle of coups, of color revolutions and coups that we saw in the early 2000s in places like Georgia and Kyrgyzia and other places like that, and which culminated in that in the color revolution that took place, in the uprising which took place in Ukraine in February 2014, that process has now ended. Just as the Russians have made it clear that Ukraine cannot enter NATO and that they're prepared to use force to prevent that happening, they've now made it clear that they will not tolerate color revolutions within the territory of the former Soviet Union. And just as the Russian declarations that they will act to prevent Ukraine joining NATO and are prepared to use force to put that into effect, just as that has in effect meant that eastward expansion of NATO into the territory of the former Soviet Union has effectively ended, has effectively been stopped. So the Russian actions in Belarus, but perhaps most importantly now in Kazakhstan, mean that the experiments in color revolutions and such like things, regime change attempts in these countries in the former Soviet Union, particularly in Central Asia, have now almost certainly ended as well. Now, having said all of this, I think it is now overwhelmingly likely that Mr. Tokayev will consolidate control of the situation. It is not completely impossible that there will continue to be, over the next few years, some sort of insurrection, some sort of insurgency against his government. There have been some suggestions of extreme violence by some of the protesters against some of the security forces. I'm not going to comment or discuss those. Again, I'd like to see some independent evidence that this is actually the case before I accepted some of the more extreme accounts of violence against some of these security forces. But if these accounts are true, then I have to say that some of the examples of violence remind me to a certain extent of some of the violence used by people who were involved in the insurgency in Syria. And that might suggest some sort of jihadi involvement in these protests. I have to say that doesn't sound to me entirely consistent with the whole range of the protests that I've been hearing up to now. Indeed, I've been hearing that some of the protesters, some of these militia people, were heavily inebriated with alcohol. There was a Reuters report that vodka was being passed around. So it's possible that that doesn't seem to be very consistent with jihadi fighters involved. But if there is an attempt to organize a jihadi insurgency in Kazakhstan, my own view is that all that will do is it will consolidate Kazakh society even more strongly behind the government, especially the Russian-speaking part of it, which, as I've said, is the majority. Now, if this was a color revolution attempt in Kazakhstan, if this was something that was attempted by some intelligence agency, then as of the time of this video, it seems not only to have failed, it seems, as far as I can see, to have achieved the diametrically opposite result of the one intended. It's quite clear to me that the outcome, or at least the likely outcome, is the replacement of a of a leader of Kazakhstan, Nazarbayev, whom the Russians had increasingly come to see as unreliable, with a different leader, Mr. Tokayev, who is probably not only far more reliable, but who is also now aware of the extent to which he is dependent on Russia for his own position. Just as Lukashenko in Belarus tried to play the Russians off against the West, but now understands that it is the Russians he has to turn to, and it is the Russians he must depend upon. So it seems to me that the Kazakh government, from having previously, under Nazarbayev, tried to play the West and the Russians off against each other, now has little choice but to commit completely to the Russians. So a government that was previously ambivalent about its relationship with Russia is now being replaced by a government that is not only dependent on Russia, but which will be almost certainly deeply committed to the relationship to Russia. That will, of course, put the Russians in pole position to strengthen their grip over Kazakhstan's resources, its natural gas and oil wealth, and of course its uranium deposits, which apparently account for something like 40% of production of the world's uranium. And as we know, where the Russians go, the Chinese, with their suitcases full of cash, follow, and we're quite likely to see Kazakhstan, China more involved in Kazakhstan also. Last but not least, I would not personally be surprised if at the end of this process we were to see some sort of Russian military presence in Kazakhstan on a semi-permanent basis. This force that is being deployed to Kazakhstan now from Russia is supposed to be there only for a limited time. But nothing can be more permanent sometimes in world politics than what is described as temporary. I personally would not be surprised if we were to start to see Russian military bases being established in Kazakhstan, just as we see them in places like Kyrgyzia and to a great extent in Tajikistan, also further tightening Russian and by extension Chinese control over Central Asia. Last but not least, I should say that of course the Russians already have a military presence in Kazakhstan, though it is not one that has been deployed to the cities. It's not one that is being used at the moment to gain control of the situation. The Russians, of course, have security forces around their big spaceport, or cosmodrome as they call it, in Baikonur, still the largest spaceport used by the Russian space program. That force is there, and we've learned that it has recently, over the last few days, unsurprisingly, been placed on higher alert. So, in a program, in my live stream, which I did on Locals yesterday, I said that one of the consistent features of colour revolution attempts in Central Asia is that they end up with the Russians coming out on top and with the Russians ultimately tightening their grip on Central Asia. As this program ends, that looks like it's going to repeat itself in Kazakhstan. Moreover, and going beyond that, it also leads me to think that, as I said, that this period of colour revolutions is now coming to an end. And one was attempted in Belarus last year, and it failed, partly because the Russians exerted themselves to make sure that it would fail. And the same seems to have happened this year in Kazakhstan. Well, thank you for joining me again today for this program. I look forward to you joining me again in future programs, both on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. Remember also to check us out on Locals, a platform where we are now an active and major presence, where I do live streams every Wednesday, and where you will find me busy commenting on all sorts of things and publishing exclusive content. And I should say Alex is extremely busy publishing exclusive content on Locals, as are many of our community there also. And of course, we're also present on all sorts of other platforms: BitChute, Library, SuperU, Rumble, which is now teamed up with Locals. And of course, you can also support us if you wish via Patreon and Subscribestar, and also by going to our shop, buying yourself mugs like this Good Day mug. And of course, don't forget to tick the like button to this video if you've liked this program, and also please remember to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again soon, and have a very good day until then.